and welcome to this Bright Talk webinar from a not so sunny London at Cloud Expo in Excel. I'm going to be talking today about redefining networking in a cloud world, and I'm joined by Justin Day from Cloud Gateway and from David Luke from NGINX. We're going to have a chat about the various aspects of networking, but if you have any questions, you will see underneath the video where I'm pointing at the moment that there is a question box. If you want to submit your questions, they will appear in front of me and I can ask them live to the panel as we go along. So Justin, David, welcome. It would be great if you could just give us a bit of a background on each of you.
I'll go first. My name's Justin Day. I'm the CEO now of Cloud Gateway, which was a company incorporated in 2017 as a hybrid cloud connectivity platform as a service. All of those words all in one. But my background is actually specifically networking, network security. I always consider myself a telco baby. I was one of the people lucky enough in their early 20s to be taken under the wing of cable and wireless and grown through a network background.
And David?
Yeah, my name's David Luke. I was also a telco baby, funnily enough, back in the days of graduate recruitment schemes, when those things used to be good. I am an enterprise solution architect for NGINX on the application delivery side of things. And yeah, I've been working in telco and IT for longer than I should probably admit in public. So yeah, it's great to be here today, and thank you.
So, given that you both are telco babies in that sense, maybe a more traditional description of the industry, we're now in the world of cloud, and we're here to talk about how networking is going to be, how networking may change in the cloud. But I guess, maybe it's a bit of a basic question to ask at Cloud Expo, but I think it's really useful to get a level set of what is cloud? What does cloud actually mean, particularly in the networking world?
Yeah, so I think, when we say what is cloud, I think it's one of those questions that yields multiple answers from multiple people, and I don't know that there's necessarily a right answer. And I think that's the thing. People search for this right answer, and if you look into the 5 pillars, 6 pillars of what's the mastermind answer, you'll get your pay-as-you-go, self-service, auto-scaling, all those good things. But I think for me, what it is choice and pace of change. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it started to afford to customers, to organizations and businesses out there, which means that they can be taking different types of cloud, they can take different types of connectivity, different types of service and application, and that pace of change that wraps up something that in the past, particularly in the telco world, as which I'm sure we're used to, has been a rather large journey. So the 90-day lead times, excessive construction charges, ripping up roads, those sorts of things are not necessarily gone, but they're dealt with in a very different way.
And a different view on that, perhaps?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything, especially the fact that there is no one set definition. For me, I take a view of cloud as you don't have to build your own physical infrastructure. So back in the old days of buying servers, buying routers, switches, you would rack and stack them, you'd have a data center, or you'd have to co-locate with somebody who did. You'd be responsible for every aspect of scaling it out, building it up, making it enterprise grade. And everybody had their own physical tin somewhere. Cloud, I think, as if you want for that one word, I think it takes you from that and into an area where you don't have to own that tin or look after it. But that's just the beginning. I think it moves, the definition extends and keeps changing and getting bigger every year as more and more ideas and services appear in the cloud. So yeah, what started out as not having to own your own tin has become so much more now. I think that could be a whole discussion in itself. So.
Well, I'm going to make that even worse then, because the other word that comes along quite a lot with cloud is the word hybrid, which is, I think, generally defined as, well, we've got some stuff we have to keep in the old-fashioned way, and we've got the cloud. I mean, is that a fair definition?
I think, yeah. I mean, to me, hybrid cloud is basically the idea where you start off with on-prem. So you've got all this legacy stuff and maybe some very old database systems which are monolithic, been there for years, can't really pick them up, move them to the cloud. Then you think, okay, well, we'll start developing some new stuff and we'll host it in one of the big 3 guys, Amazon maybe, or Google or Microsoft. And we'll host some things there, we'll maybe rent some virtual machines there, or even dabble in a bit of containerization and build out from there. And then you might say, well, we'll use Amazon's load balancers, ELB, ALB, and then another team in another part of your business, in another business unit perhaps, they decide then to put something in a different cloud provider, and suddenly you've got a hybrid cloud strategy without probably even realizing that's what you were going for. And then somebody else says, well, look, you've got to rationalize this. What about having a workload that could dynamically run on-prem or suddenly leap off into Amazon or leap off into Azure or DigitalOcean or wherever? Then that's the challenge of a hybrid cloud, is having the systems in place where you can forget you've got multiple cloud providers and automatically scale onto them in a cost-efficient way without having a huge operational challenge.
Which is quite a networking challenge, ultimately, which is what we're here to talk about, is actually how do you join all of that up? And I think a lot of people, when they look at cloud, they think, well, that's what the internet's for. It's 30 years old today. It must have been invented for a purpose, although, according to Mr. Berners-Lee, perhaps not the purpose he had in mind at the time. So is the internet the answer to the question?
I mean, for me, no. I know this is an unpopular opinion and one I'm sure to yield some questions against, but I think what hybrid has brought is an understanding and a realization that actually there's a number of options that may be right for whatever that requirement is. I always remember being taught, going back to the telco baby, don't let a solution define your requirement. I think in more recent times that's become, don't let cloud define your requirement. And where I think the internet has been seen as this kind of panacea of, this is going to take everything, it's going to make it all work. The market hype behind the SD-WAN providers, the agile network, all of these good things. The internet is there, it's a wonderful resource. It's a resource that can be used, can be consumed, and is actually the right mechanism for many requirements. It might be for cost effectiveness, it might be for something that you're not too worried about latency, the usual things you wouldn't get with your private. But for me, there has to be a blend. And I think hybrid is now extending outside of the world of cloud, outside of this. It's becoming this, what is the right fit? What is the right requirement, right fit for what the business needs? And that is now pulling back into the connectivity world. Because private networks, they get a hard time. I think most people associate, from our past in particular, private network equals MPLS. MPLS equals big nasty incumbent provider, equals massive commercial tie-in, and it's hugely expensive. Well, actually, a lot of the wires and the things that are in the ground at the exchanges are all the same thing. And then they're just used in very sort of, logically different ways. And actually, these price points have come in closer. So bringing those into something that can be knitted into something where you can use the right connectivity for the right requirement, that's where I think networking is starting to pull away from internet being the right answer.
So it's not the default, there are options around it.
There definitely are, yeah.
And I think that there is that perception. I've heard a lot of organisations saying that the one thing about the cloud is we spend less on servers, but we have to spend huge amounts on the network because obviously everything's outside of our data centre now.
Yeah.
And essentially what we're saying is actually you can manage that, you can balance that in a different way.
I think you can. I think you can balance it. I think the cloud providers, when cloud was not necessarily becoming a thing, but certainly its marketing was becoming a thing. We can go back a good few years now. I think there was this view that architecturally it would always be consumed across the internet, it would be managed on the internet, be fronted on the internet. The internet would become this thing. And I think, if we go into the deep, dark nasties of cloud, I remember seeing for the first time that layer 2 had been removed from the cloud. And as a network background person, that's absolutely horrifying. But seeing that for the first time, seeing as what the cloud providers had tried to simplify networking for the right reasons, that was great. But we now are having to pull back. I know that working with Microsoft a few years ago, their architectural desire was to step away from Express Route. They took the likes of O365 and they wanted to push that on the internet. And that was as much about how they'd written the codecs and what they'd done inside the application as it was trying to move away from infrastructure they had no interest in and they didn't want to be a part of. What they've done nicely is recognise that actually that's not what industry wants. They do want a blend. It is right for right requirements. Step back from that. So I think it's about bringing that blend back, and I think that is really starting to grow back up. I think less things are being looked at as put on the internet.
And that same experience?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all those sentiments. I mean, I think that you mentioned MPLS and SD-WAN, and MPLS was initially built to solve a problem of not how do you get to the cloud, but how do you get from the office in Newcastle to the office in London and get a quality of service that you can take to the bank for time-critical applications and real-time applications to work and all the rest of it. I mean, SD-WAN then came along as a huge buzz thereafter in the last year or so. But I don't have the answer to whether they are what you would want to use to connect to a cloud provider. And various cloud providers have their own connectivity solutions where they could say to you, well, we'll give you this quality of service. You also have to ask, is architecting modern applications now, I think for application developers, the challenge is not to go in for these kind of legacy architectures where you had a dedicated link that you knew every packet was going to get there in a finite time. You can architect around that and design systems to be less sensitive to real-time criticality. I mean, I was looking at a banking system the other day. It's been there a long time, and it basically dials up a single TCP connection in the morning and then hangs on to that for the whole day, and then 5 p.m. when the traders go home, and down it goes. And of course, that is an incredibly, all of the things I mentioned, you've got to have some kind of incredibly hard, resilient, robust link underneath that. But if you re-architected that system, you wouldn't need it. So that's another point, I think.
Although ultimately we're still governed by the laws of physics. There's only a certain speed you can actually get from Newcastle to London in the first place. But there are different routes to get there. I think the other thing that intrigues me is with the express routes and the other dedicated services from other cloud providers is the level of ingress and egress charges that they put around it. I think there has to be an element of commercial architecture when you go into this. You know, the number of organisations I've come across who carefully crafted their business case, and that was the part it fell apart. I mean, are there commercial reasons perhaps to go a different way, or is that actually a number that's scaring people unnecessarily when they see that?
So I'd say that's it could be looked at in both ways. So egress data charges were, and still to today, are a cost that seems to be forgotten when it's factoring in what is cloud going to cost me. An egress data charge is, as a rule, vastly more expensive if you are egressing out onto the internet direct from the cloud, typically about 9 cents a gigabyte, whereas it's about 2 cents or 1 cent if you're coming onto a private connection. Now, when you look at what that workload may be, you should be able to have a rough idea, if you've got a good idea of what your application is doing, what that will translate to in cost, and that may give you the answer to what's the better way to go. I think in isolation, as a standalone application, rarely is there such a chunky workload that is in isolation becoming a decision point. I think when you're looking at the sum of all the parts, and you're looking at how you build and you stitch that together, then it starts to become a factor that's more expensive. So single application, unless you've got some really, really big, hulking database-based workload that's absolutely churning out, maybe not, but that might be something that's actually better suited to private connectivity anyway. So in isolation, no. Some of the parts absolutely should be.
And I think perhaps there's a thought process that goes a little bit when people are going from an on-prem environment up to the cloud. On-prem, there's a bunch of sunk cost in what they've got, rather like when you used to put, and show my age now, LAN extensions to connect the office from Newcastle to Birmingham. But there was an amount of space. You could just use it. It didn't cost you anything. It cost you whatever it cost you. Whereas now we're seeing price per use on internet. I guess it's that same thought process that's moving.
It is. And I mean, this again, both of us come from a telecom background. So in telecoms, it's called bill shock, where you get your mobile phone bill at the end of the month and you say, hang on a minute, how did I get to £73? This is a £45 a month tariff.
Telecoms, it's called that in my house as well.
yeah, exactly. It's a widespread problem. And I think if you peer under the skin and you go through line by line, you find out where these hidden charges came from. And I think the same is true of cloud providers. In the old days, like you say, you could invest in hardware, you could rent an MPLS line for X a month. Doesn't matter whether you put 1 byte or a bazillion down it, you pay that a month. Your controls are upfront, they're fixed for the total cost of ownership. You could depreciate your hardware, you know how much it's going to cost exactly. So you go in with your eyes open. You say, this is going to cost me this for 5 years, and it's CapEx. But the cloud providers use convoluted and difficult, deliberately, obfuscation, I think, of their charging models so that these OPEX charges can grow and grow, and egress traffic, ingress traffic, and that's just two metrics they use. And I think that is a problem in the industry. It's just, it's trying to catch customers out. Even if you're a private user and you go onto, and I won't mention any names, but go onto one of the major big 3 cloud providers, set up an account, and they say, oh, put your credit card in. Oh, we won't charge you. You can have one little machine for X hours a month, and we won't charge you unless you go over it. You run it up there, put some workloads on it. Oh dear, I've gone over it. That's 23 quid. And that on a massive scale is what happens in the industry.
Mm. And I think that actually touches on another point, probably outside of networking specifically, but cloud. You know, what cloud has brought to us. I know being able to spin things up quickly and deliver all these workloads at pace, which I say is the beauty of cloud. That's great. But so much governance and control has been taken out of what there was yesteryear. And I'm not saying we should go back to that. I'm not saying we should go back to archaic procurement mechanisms that take 3 months to get one bit of tin to get in a data center. But like you say, you knew how much that tin was going to cost, when it was going to turn up, what it was going to be. Now, you don't really know, and also there's often no control. Mm-hmm. So I don't often see a CFO who can honestly say, oh, you know, I know exactly what I've got. No, what they see is a little ticking timer in the right, which then drops out to what they have to spend. So I think you're right in saying it is obfuscated. I think sometimes you can see things more clearly, but definitely you're led, to the water and sort of you're cheated there a little bit.
Actually, as an ex-CFO myself, I can tell you that I'd rather have that certainty. I'd rather somebody tells me it costs that, even if I've got to do the capital expense. And I think there's a lot of that still. There's a lot of CFOs back from my day, many years ago, who are potentially thinking like that. And when we in IT, as I am now, go over and say, well, broadly it's going to cost somewhere in this range, it's like, I don't need ranges, I need numbers. Yeah. And it becomes really difficult to try and account for. And it's also quite a challenge to ask the application team what the traffic is that's coming out of their systems sometimes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a lot of questions, a lot of answers, a lot of costs. The OPEX CAPEX one is interesting for us as well. When we were embarking upon Cloud Gateway, one of our kind of key things we were trying to do was move away from a CAPEX model towards OPEX, because we thought that was the feedback we were getting, and that's what everybody wanted. That was cloud consumption, and away we go. We've had an interesting amount of conversations, typically with CFOs, typically with those in the finance department, who have said, I'm not interested in OPEX. I want to move back to CAPEX. I need some certainty of what this is going to cost. I can't work with a budget that we think it's in here, but it might be out here. So yes, interesting.
I'm glad you said that, because it is, there is definitely that challenge between the two. And I think sometimes, as you say, everybody chants the mantra of OPEX and then looks really puzzled when the CFO does actually go, not always, that's not always the right way. I think the other area as well, I mean, when cloud first emerged, not only was that sort of uncertainty over cost that bothered people, there was also the and it's still quite high on the list that people look at, of security. Now, I think everybody's now realizing that the AWSs, the Azures, the Googles of the world are ultimately highly secure from the outside. You can't get into their data centers. Their budget is eye-watering, but clearly there's still all the transit mechanisms there. So the network, to me, has become the vulnerable point. So do we have to think differently now about networking and the security in the cloud world? And what do we have to look at?
Well, I think my previous answer to a previous question about the old hardware days, if we think in terms of like a legacy hardware model, you might have a firewall, which would be an expensive box from a premium multinational vendor in your data center. Then you might have load balancer. You might have other security features like an application layer firewall as well. And traditionally, these would be on your north-south interface. So everything coming in would have to go through these appliances one by one and be rigorously screened and checked. Terminate SSL and a number of other use cases, mostly at a hardware level. And once you move to the cloud, you lose all of those vendors. And then you're faced with replicating those functions on your inbound link from wherever it may be. You've got traffic, you could have traffic coming in from the internet, from anybody. And you would need to give that the same level of screening and security treatment as you did in your on-prem data center. You cannot say, oh, well, we're going to let this go in a bit more easily. You have to have the same control. And again, all of the major cloud providers have proprietary solutions for firewalling and application level firewalling, load balancing, reverse proxying, SSL termination, certificate management, and everything else. But of course, that doesn't really tie into the hybrid cloud strategy where you need a portable solution that can work in any cloud. So, I mean, I would say that the key thing is to look for software infrastructure that rivals in terms of its performance or exceeds some of those existing legacy physical appliance vendors that can actually work in a cloud agnostic fashion. And those, I think, will be the key to actually, unlocking the full potential of cloud with regard to security and firewalling and all the rest of it. It's the one thing I will say though is it's got to be high. Some of these hardware boxes have got high performance optimizations for some of those heavy duty things like SSL. So yeah, look for something high performance. But yeah, cloud agnostic I think would be the key. You can still choose your cloud provider. You can be with any of the big three guys happily. But once you start getting onto their specific products, not only do you fall into the trap you mentioned with the capex, with the opex going crazy and the capex not being predictable, but you will also get yourself, very much out of that if you have a proper cloud agnostic solution that you can move.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say absolutely the same. Is when we talk about hybrid cloud, I think there's, because of where public cloud has got to, and because it is fashionable, cloud is on vogue. Let's be entirely honest. The thought of having an infrastructure outside of the recognised public cloud providers, and let's say that you bring that architecture so that all traffic has to come back there, feels to a lot of people like a step backwards. Oh, it's something that's in a data centre. Well, I'm afraid that's what the cloud is. It's stuff that's in a data center, and so pulling that back to a common point and being able to have that as your the key set of your architecture, that centralized part of your architecture. Take it out if necessary. Put it on tin. Tin still had a place. Maybe it doesn't need to be tin. Things can be virtualized across tin. That's been done for tens and tens of years. For me, absolutely, I would be pulling that traffic to a central point, and I think. Another thing for me, again, another one of my unpopular opinions, but security in the world that I came from, the world that we came from, was a function of networking. Does that make it right? No, because I think it's part of a broader spectrum of cybersecurity, which has had to grow extensively, with the access to the internet and the way tech has grown in the last 10, 15 years. That's fine. But we have to consider the skill sets of the people who were looking at those things. And that's not a slight on the people who are building traditional workloads in cloud. However, the sort of people that are more likely to build inside of the public cloud, or certainly what I have been experiencing, are people that are from the development community, very good infrastructure people, very good developers, brilliant application people. These are great people who have not come from a security background. And the tendency, like you say, is to why would you not trust an Amazon or Microsoft if they say, as part of my ecosystem, I have box X, and as long as you make that a bump in your logical wire, everything is safe. Well, great. But then they don't actually understand quite what the finite component parts are. And I think that's become a little bit of a problem as well, the kind of a bit of a skill set gap and getting the right people in there as well.
So it's getting the right people in the right process. I mean, it's a bit like earlier when we were talking about governance. It's still, in that world of cloud, still having a strong governance structure around it that says there are still a set of rules that need to be followed.
Absolutely.
They need not perhaps be as limiting as they were in the past.
No, and I think we were touching earlier on where cloud providers have made things easy. A personal bugbear of mine is NSGs, and NSGs are, for me, not firewalls. They're for someone who comes from a network background. That's to me is a root control more than anything else. And I've seen them deployed regularly as an answer to, well, I have some security, and that's it can instill fake confidence in people that need it. So.
Well, it was interesting. We were talking on a panel this morning about security in general around the cloud, and one of the conclusions we came to is that historically a lot of people have bought a lot of security products because they felt they needed them, and then they've sat on the shelf, and that's not necessarily been done. And there is a whole need to change attitude towards security in the cloud and build it into process as much as there is anything else, which I think seems to follow here as well. And also we were talking about actually compliance needs to be a centralized version of looking through, and in a sense what we're saying is you can realistically pull the security back to a point where it then brokers the entry point in there, and that's not a wrong approach.
No, I don't think that's the wrong approach. And I think, like I said, that cybersecurity is I'm not going to pretend and profess to be part of the cybersecurity industry, but it is a multifaceted approach to all of these things. Another thing to think about is what you're doing with your log aggregation. What are you doing with the sort of data you typically put into a SIEM nowadays? Having that come through a centralized point may be a better single source of truth, a little bit of additional granularity that means that you can take that off to something that then those cyber guys, those guys who are more experienced and skilled in that field, can do more with that data. So there's definitely different approaches to that as well.
So, okay. We've had a question from the audience, slightly to the side, but we'll ask it anyway, which is, what criteria besides budgets do the C-level executives need to consider when incorporating cloud, hybrid cloud, and the integration of different systems for the organisation?
Cool, blimey.
Wow.
What a great question that is.
Yeah.
Now we need a great answer.
Well, a great answer. So for C-level people who are looking at getting into this for the first time, other than budgets, I mean, we've already mentioned exactly why budgets are important, how you can very easily fall into the CapEx/OpEx/total cost of ownership trap. I think the other one would be, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is to try and pursue a cloud agnostic strategy where possible. I was speaking recently with a tier 1 financial institution, and they want a private cloud for security reasons. They have a perception that a public cloud is not going to be secure enough for a banking environment. So they're going to have a private cloud, but they don't know how to build that. So they've asked one of the big 3 cloud providers to do it for them.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it's a bit like asking Mercedes to come around your house and build a car in your garage. It's that equivalent.
Yeah.
But that's what they're doing, and that's their strategy. And I would say that's all very well, but the cloud agnostic, if this is your first foray as a C-level exec and you want to get into a cloud strategy, start agnostic. You may well end up getting into one particular provider and perhaps getting hooked on one or more products, but always try and take that agnostic path through, because it will pay off very quickly.
Yeah, I'll give a different, not a different answer that contradicts that at all, that adds to that. To me, if a CFO is traditionally looking for tangible monetary saving, I think moving forward is the intangible. And what I mean by the intangible is, if I can make cost savings against boxes, so if I had 10 boxes, I now have 1 box, I save 9 boxes, and all those things as well. I think what the C-level executives should be looking at is, what is the cost, or what is the price, or what is the value of agility? What is the value of having something that is on tap that I don't necessarily need today, but I need tomorrow? A new technology spins up, a new cloud that I need immediate connectivity to, a new service, something that we can use our data to exploit to help our customers. And I think that's a real mindset shift for C-level executives, particularly when absolutely they are going to look at budget. Budget is money, money is finite. That's it's a nice easy variable if you're a maths person like me who loves numbers. But trying to, it's almost like selling insurance. It was like of yesteryear trying to convince those people you needed a firewall, and the first question that came in was, when was the last time we had a security incident? Well, we haven't had one. Well, I don't need it. It's that sort of thing. Is only the business can understand the price of the agility brought to them for something they don't know they need tomorrow. And that is so tough. I'm hoping that's a great answer. You asked for one. I think that's so tough, and it's such an important consideration to put alongside the budget. Neither of them outweighs the other.
It's learning to trade the certainty against the agility.
Absolutely.
And I think in the world that we live in, that has to be a fair trade-off. I think people are realising, most C-levels are now starting to realise that actually if they're not agile, somebody will come along and eat their lunch.
Indeed.
So we've got to kind of build this underpinning infrastructure, because to me the network, going back to the reason we're here, is still about what joins all of this together. And we have all of these options. We have the different cloud providers. We have the public cloud. We have the private cloud. We have traditional on-prem. I mean, my company is a big provider of mainframe managed services, and there are still a lot of mainframes out there. Apparently they were due to die not long after the internet was born. Hasn't quite worked out like that. And that's very simple, because that's a network in a box. but that now needs to talk out as well. So what are the kind of principles that we need to go through to build that infrastructure that allows us the agility, but the security, ideally the cost certainty? You know, what kind of guiding principles can we use now that perhaps we haven't used before?
I think for what we call within the company I work is we call them monoliths. These sort of legacy solutions, they might be huge, great databases, or any system that is essentially, more or less a black box solution that's very complex, very immature, very expensive, and very business critical. So you want to start maybe breaking those down and starting to peel information off. You might have a legacy system and you want to create an API into it and start writing a few apps that outlie it, and then exposing an API that can pull information from it and break it down gently. And to do that, the one thing that jumps to mind, and one possible solution is, you've probably heard of service meshes before, I'm sure a lot of the audience have as well. And a service mesh solution, if it's done correctly, can also talk outside of, let's say, a Kubernetes cluster or some other orchestrated container environment, and actually allow you to integrate some of those legacy monoliths. So I think the key with those is to work with them to build these outlying applications that can query them and then structure the data. And you can then, once you've got various methods for pulling data out of these monoliths, whatever you want, you can then integrate them with an API gateway, build that in a service mesh so it can then communicate with all your other microservices and modern applications. So yeah, I'm firmly of the belief that you can't just rip and replace these monoliths. You have to work with them, and you have to start peeling layers of the onion one by one until you've unlocked the potential in there without throwing it away and starting again and costing yourself millions.
Yeah, I think it's more important than it's ever been to build those applications, modernize those applications with networking and connectivity in mind from the outset. Now, like you say, talking about APIs, the use of APIs and API gateways and things like that. And I think that's how we have found ourselves in a hybrid world, which is somewhere where I think we will stay, because I think it's actually positive. But like you say, what this was to start with was more a digital transformation, which for many people was just lifting and shifting into a public cloud, badging it as a digital transformation. But you can't move everything in one go, so things needed to reach back, and actually things needed to stay. Mainframe became probably the really obvious one of, well, that's not going anywhere. We pull those things together. So I think it's about those thoughts around what's best, what's the right requirement. Let's consider each one of these things from the ground up as we're modernizing our applications. Let's get the guys in who are thinking about APIs, who are thinking about things that we wouldn't have considered for application X in the past. Let's consider what's the best of public and private and how we can stitch this all together, with a view that by the time we get to, let's say we take all of these applications out of a major financial services organization or something, the next big thing will be here. And actually we'll need to modernize the application that in this instance is the most modernized application, and there'll be something else that isn't API today. And AI will be doing something, and RPA will be doing something. And so it's about that constant cycle needs that bedrock underneath it to allow it to continue to turn. So for me, it's absolutely that. It's doing what you can with thinking about those modern ways of doing it as you're touching and going through that.
That makes sense. I'm with you. I think people seem to use hybrid as a temporary state. And I think it's going to be around for a long time. And with the growth of things like edge computing, it's albeit, the on-prem data center might now be the top of a radio mast. It's still a data center in that sense. It still needs to communicate. And I think the other thing that strikes me that is highly traffic dependent, I use the word traffic rather than network at the moment, is IoT, because there are all of those devices. And is there a different thought process we need for managing all of those devices connecting back compared to what we've had in the past? Or is the internet just the answer to that?
Well, it's a good question, because IoT is one of those technologies, group of technologies that's exploded in the last 2 years. Every week I find out there's a new IoT protocol which has appeared, and it claims to use less packets and shift more information with a smaller payload. And there are dozens of them. And I bumped into a use case recently where there's a container vessel with, those enormous freighters that carry thousands of containers for long periods of time. And they've got an IoT system they want to set up, which is going to have a sensor in each of these containers. So thousands of sensors in these containers, measuring things like humidity, temperature, and other vital health factors of that container. And then that's all feeding into a system that can suddenly, an alarm bell will ring and send a guy down if pressure drops in container number 730. And then we're talking about connected cars. And so IoT is this explosive environment where we need enormous connectivity. And it's got to be ultra efficient, running in the tightest, most neatly packed protocol with the most minimal overhead. So this is a fresh challenge. And I mean, this particular container freight example, of course, is isolated. They can put whatever network infrastructure on the vessel, so it's essentially self-contained. But once that gets across the whole globe, then even though these protocols can be as lightweight as they like, but if there's billions of messages from millions of devices, then it's going to be a huge overhead. And 5G in the mobile side is touted as the great future to suddenly enable the Internet of Things. Suddenly we'll have another generation of mobile technology. We'll have 5 times the spectral efficiency that we used to have, 5 times the data, maybe more, maybe 10 times once they get going. And that'll be fine. All the IoT stuff can jump over that. That's one suggested solution, but I don't know the full answer.
I love that because I was at a talk about this, and I am by no means an expert on either 5G or IoT. Both of those worry me because almost everyone around the table didn't appear to come from a comms background. So I was hearing the wonderment of these technologies that we could make use of, and 1 millisecond was this promise of 5G, and this is absolutely wonderful. Until of course 5G drops down the mast and into the cranky old cable that someone who isn't actually under the auspice of DCMS doesn't have to change their cable, and we're actually back on an infrastructure that still is the internet. I absolutely am on and in agreement with this. It's not scaremongering. Look, there's the internet's massive. The bandwidth, the pipes, everything that's out there, new signals, new ranges, frequencies, everything. That's great. But the more and more and more we put on, more importantly, the criticality of those things we put on is where we need to start to take this a little bit more seriously and start thinking. For me, when you start talking about things, the conversation we were having around the health sector. We were talking about real-time. We were actually talking about real-time surgery and things like this. And in my mind, you come from a telco background. You think about resilience. You think about failure, and you think about if someone's in the middle of a surgery, last thing you want is a bit of jitter. That's not what you need.
Yeah.
So I worry that again there's a little bit of an overthought there. And I think what you're going to find is when you open Pandora's box, you're going to have some nasties come out, because all of a sudden there are some wonderful use cases, there are some wonderful things to put on there, but very soon you're going to find everyone that produces a cereal box has some kind of hook in and tells them how many cornflakes you've eaten. And you're like, well, that's just a waste of traffic. And anyway, these are luckily not for me to worry about just yet. But.
Well, they might be, because we've just been asked an interesting question actually, which is, so we've had containers and we've had cereal packets, but the question is, what sectors or industries do you expect IoT or edge computing will expand into in the near future?
Okay.
Is there anything beyond the obvious?
Oh, I was actually going to go with the obvious to start with.
I've got one outside. A friend of mine contacted me recently. Said he's up in Nova Scotia in Canada, and he said, "Oh, well, I've joined this new IoT company." I thought, "Oh, okay, connected cars, all the usual suspects, blah blah blah, And he said it's a microbrewery. And it's not a micro, it's a solution for microbreweries. The idea is that their brewing is all based around, they've got all those huge copper urns, and it's a number of industrial processes which have to be administered manually. If you could put IoT sensors strategically around these microbreweries, you could automate a huge amount of production. You could reduce a vast amount of cost in wastage, loss. If one guy forgets to turn the heater off 3 minutes, then a whole batch of beer's ruined, and $300 dollars worth of barley's wasted and so on, and a day's wasted, and then it's a day late to the beer supplier, and then it's a day late to Wetherspoons, who will significantly kill you if that happens, because I mean it's one of these ultra-tight supply chains now, brewing. So he was saying this could be enormous. So it's these little things you don't think of, like microbreweries, that are potentially good applications for IoT.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was going to go down the really easy route of insurance. I think that's an obvious one for me. You've got your, again, cars. You've got the sort of pay-as-you-go type travel insurance. You've got and starting to ascertain and understand risk. I think the actuarial community is going to go absolutely mad for this. I think this is really, really interesting. I think for me, I don't have a real use case, but for me, health is going to be one. People seem to have this craze. As you'd imagine, we've all probably had a Fitbit or something like this. I think we're going to see is actually more and more things that integrate into exactly how you're living, your lifestyle, that come together and start, because it's not just the Internet of Things, it's not just the single things, it's the bringing together of the data that goes to a system that analyzes what you're doing. It's that bringing everything together. And I think there's a huge market there. I think it's very popular. Again, it's 10 years ago, people didn't seem to care about health quite as much, particularly not from this sort of thing. But I think that has a huge market, huge application, and I don't want to be cynical about that. I think that could be really positive, but it's also the first big step towards quite the big brother as well. So interesting times.
They are indeed, and I think we've covered a lot there, and that's been fascinating. I think it's interesting. You've got health on the one hand and breweries on the other. Maybe there needs to be some synergy between the two somewhere down the line, with an alarm that says you've drunk too much.
Yeah, or not enough, of course.
Well, yes, that is one option. So thank you, Justin. Thank you, David, and thank you for watching, and thank you for the questions that you've sent in as well. I hope we answered them. And here from Cloud Expo today. Goodbye.